Game of musical chairs. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Nick Hyam. Not many speakers here in the Sheldonian get to pack the place out. This is the first time I've hosted a number of events here down the years, and I think this is the first time I can recall people right up there in the gods. David Starkey is one of the few people who can indeed pack out the Sheldonian theatre. You all know who he is, you all know his background, the Tudor historian, the television presenter, a stalwart for many years of the Moral Maze on Radio 4, professional controversialist, famously described by the Daily Mail as the rudest man in Britain. He once seemed ubiquitous. He was everywhere. You couldn't move without finding Starky saying something thoroughly pertinent. Before today, I'd met him only once. That was some years ago when the Handel House Museum in London put on an exhibition devoted to the castrati, the 18th century opera superstars for whom Handel wrote some of his best music. And I was standing there talking to the curators, and we were remarking on how well-known and famous these people were and how wonderful the music was. And then Starky turned up and he said, "Let us not forget that this whole thing was based on the most unspeakable cruelty and taking 12-year-old boys and forcibly castrating them." And he pointed rather dramatically to the implements which were used for this, which were part of the exhibition. And it dispelled all that comfortable complacency and brought a much-needed moment of reality into the discussion. As I say, used to be ubiquitous, but he hasn't made a television program since 2017. He hasn't published a book since 2020, because that was the year that a throwaway remark on a political podcast provoked a sudden and furious backlash. He was forced to resign his honorary, you volunteered to resign your honorary fellowship at Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge. He was forced to resign from any number of other bodies. He lost his Medlicott Medal for services to history, and he was, to use the fashionable phrase, cancelled. Now, once we might have called him politically incorrect. We might have thought he was bracingly so if we agreed with him. We might have thought he was deplorably so if we didn't disagree with him, but that's as far as it would have gone. Now, however, the boundaries of acceptable discourse seem to have narrowed, particularly around two subjects, race and gender. Starky, with commendable courage and honesty, or alternatively, unforgivable prejudice and a crass disregard for the feelings of other people, has refused to accept this. And he's now embarked on what he calls a late Starky revival. This appearance is part of that. He has his own YouTube channel. He is busily working to remake the political right here in Britain. And he is as bracing, I suspect, and as controversial as he ever was. His talk is entitled A 21st Century Perspective, Our Life and Times Today. Seems to me to give him ample scope to say more or less anything he wants. When he's finished, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, and after that, he will be signing copies of his books, not here in the Sheldonian, but across the road in Blackwell's main bookshop in the Norrington Room. So I'll remind you of that at the end, if I remember. But first, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. David Starkey.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to be here in this magnificent building, which is a kind of architectural expression of many of the things that I want to talk about. This is modeled, as many of you will know, on a Roman theatre or indeed a Greek theatre. It is that extraordinary intersection of terrible word, which usually means something to do with race and gender, but I'm trying to use it in a better and nobler sense, that extraordinary intersection of our cultures, of the medieval, of the classical, of the English, of the foreign. What I'm wanting to do is to look at what I think is the key to how we should approach this. And it's via history. All cultures, it seems to me, need an anchorage. They need something that acts as a bedrock. Oxford, in the Middle Ages, it was, of course, the study of theology. From the Renaissance onwards, and increasingly intensified into the 19th century, it became the classics, the great world of Oxford, of the high Victorian period, centering on Balliol and Jowett, the idea of the classics as the basis of humanity, the basis of politics, the basis of argument, the basis of morality and the good life. And in a strange sort of way, that held through the public school system, through the empire, through our administration, where, of course, first in greats at Oxford opened every door. And I suppose the final despairing, rotten echo of that tradition was Boris Johnson. A noble fruit, corrupted, fallen, destroyed, become a thing of mockery. But of course, other things were bidding to take over. And we were discussing it just now when we were both at Cambridge. In the 1960s, it was the very end of another attempt, the attempt of F.R. Leavis to make the great tradition of English literature again a similar cultural, moral anchor. That too failed and dissolved in ridicule and bitterness, and we were sharing nice stories of just what a horrible, nasty woman his wife was. And again, profoundly embittered by the funeral pyre at which the vast effort of her husband had culminated in. I want now to make what is no doubt an equally rash claim for my subject, for history. I want to argue that we have to reckon and decide that we need to put something in the center of the curriculum, in the center of our politics, and in the center of almost memory and national life. And I think it's got to be history. It's perfectly clear, as we look at the developments that are going on now, that more and more education is going to concentrate on so-called STEM subjects, is going to concentrate on mathematics and physics and whatever. And we need a counter-tradition. We need a tradition which will literally embrace tradition, will mean that the mathematicians and the physicists are not left rootless. And what's very striking at the moment is looking across the Atlantic. Now, I am very aware that there's a terrible thing which I call the Jacobitism of the right at the moment. If you remember, in the 18th century, the right in politics, the Tories, ruined themselves by their infatuation with the idea of a king over the water, the Stuart claimants. The terrible risk of the right now, in Europe and perhaps in Britain in particular, is that we become similarly infatuated with another king over the water, the king of the White House. This would be a very bad idea. Nevertheless, America does offer some extremely interesting clues. What is very striking is the way in which many of the great cutting edge, the titans of the internet, the titans of tech, have embraced history and the Constitution. If you noticed at Trump's inauguration, immediately behind the president in the Great Assembly, in the rotunda of the Capitol, was the array of the richest men in the world, all there, seated at the court of King Donald. And listen to Trump. Listen to Trump, of course, and it's absurd, there's a cascade of words. Listen to Musk, listen to Peter Thiel, and it's a very different tune, and it's heavily historical. And that's what I want to argue, that's what I want to advance this claim for now. It seems to me, just to summarize very quickly, that history is, or should be, the foundation of our civilization. It is the principal means of cultural transmission. It's the source of our constitution and politics, and it's also the best means of understanding contemporary society. In other words, a kind of intellectual passepartout. Let me begin then by going back to the foundations. And I suppose it's a foundation that I also share with Leavis. Let's go right back to the beginning of England and English. Well, let's begin with the beginning of English, which is curiously later than the beginning of England. Let's go back because remember, and I'll be dealing with this point again at somewhat greater length, English is a very new language. English is only 700 years old. It only, in a recognizable form, dates to the end of the 14th century. And that's the moment of Geoffrey Chaucer, who does two things. He fuses what was left of the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the Anglo-Saxon, what had just become really a peasant dialect of grunt, to give a sort of flavor of it. And we have the war cries, the Battle of Hastings. Of course, the Norman Knights, French has assumed almost a recognizably modern form. The Norman Knights invading England cry, Dieu aide, God help us. What do the Anglo-Saxon housecarls, the great battle-axe-wielding troops of the inner household of King Harold cry, oot, 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 out, 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 like Arthur Scargill's miners. What Chaucer does is to take that tradition, Anglo-Saxon in the actual period of the Anglo-Saxon state, the pre-Norman state, had been a highly sophisticated language, which most unusually in the Europe of its time was also the language of administration and the language of recording. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the administrative charters of the various Anglo-Saxon kings. So it was a sophisticated language with conjugations, declensions, and so on. All that dies in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest, when it ceases to be a written language and instead, as I said, deteriorates, if that's the right word, into peasant dialects in which those various forms of inflected speech vanish. And it's Chaucer who amalgamates that with the Francophone culture, which had been imported by the Anglo-Norman upper class. He also does something else. He travels to Italy. He may well meet Petrarch, and he experiences that first great extraordinary collision, the historical basis of, I think, the growth of the West. Remember, what is peculiar about Western civilization is that it's a secondary civilization. We are based on the worlds of Greece and Rome, what is invoked by these buildings. And Chaucer encounters the discovery. And the discovery takes the form books. It takes the form of historical exploration. One of the most important books that they all get terribly excited about are the works of Cicero, which are preserved in quite considerable form. Some of his major works are only fragmentary, like the De Republica on the Roman state. But that was profoundly important because, as we'll see, the model of the Roman state and the model of Roman government transforms the understanding of the medieval tradition itself. Anyway, Chaucer has encountered it, he's read it, he dreams about it. Interestingly enough, thinking about politics and the invocation of the might of Rome and the glories of Rome, he goes to sleep, as many students have done, poring over difficult Latin texts. And he dreams instead not of a parliament, not of a Roman Senate, but of a parliament of fowls, of birds not engaged in debate, but making love. But there's this remarkable moment in which he reflects on why that dream was there, on what that old book had done. And this is the foundation text that I want us all to have in our minds. Chaucer says, and I'll translate into modern English, Chaucer says, just as we're in the spring now, this magical spring, April, when April with his shower of thought and whatever, with his sweet showers, except we've had no showers. It's the moment of the rebirth all around us now in the beauty of Oxford. And Chaucer anticipates that in an astonishing quatrain, 4 lines. Just as out of the cold earth, each year comes the new corn. So, from old books, new science, new learning springs. So I'm arguing for a view of history which is not passive, which is not restrictive. I'm arguing for a view of history which is creative, a view of history as a soil, a fertilized soil from which the new grows. But the new will only grow if its roots are there. We, of course, have moved into a world in which we thought it was a terribly good idea to tear up roots. And we look back with surprise when things wither, as they tend to do if you tear things up by the roots. Because remember, this notion of cultural transmission, which is also at the heart of the book. Remember, this is a profoundly, and I'm emphasizing the word, it's both a small c and a big C conservative vision. It's also the sense, it's the sense of Burke, and again, we'll explore this in detail, that notion that if there is a social compact, a social contract, it's one that's cross-generational between the dead, the living, and those still to be born. But it's much more than that, isn't it? Because it stands in a reproving contrast to the whole of the 20th century and to the whole of the notions of so-called modern art. Because can I remind you that modern art, and indeed modernity itself, is based on deliberate repudiation and destruction. Why we've gone so badly wrong in the 20th century seems to me to be this deliberate tearing up by the roots, this deliberate separation. Again, the notion of modern art, the great moment of modern art, as everybody knows, is the Marcel Duchamp, his urinal labeled fountain on exhibition in New York, where he'd retired to seek safety from the horrors of the First World War. Everybody regards that as the foundation moment of modern art. Ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't. Duchamp did not wish to be an artist. Duchamp rejected the very notion of art, like the very notion of history, like the very notion of a previous time. He wanted an absolute rupture. He did not call himself an artist, he called himself an artist, like an anarchist, the absolute moment of rupture and a break. And he makes the point perfectly explicit. What he says, should Rembrandts be used for? Ironing boards. And it's only in the 1960s, through the influence of New York, that he is reinvented, and Milan and money, that he's actually reinvented as an artist. And this notion of the obliteration of the past, of course, applies to town planning, to the hideous rebuilding under the influence of modernism of British cities, which is one, I think, of the central reasons for the commercial failure of the British city, the sheer ugliness. Anybody who's been to a Birmingham, anybody who's been to Coventry, anybody who's been to Plymouth sees the terrible consequences of that rupture. And can I remind you that Duchamp is not unique. Very interesting discovery about Miro, the Spanish modernist. He went out of his way to paint on top of previous paintings, to destroy them. And as a symbol, I think, of how deep this notion of rejection is, one of his most important paintings, it's just been discovered, was painted over a portrait of his own mother. That sense of rupture, of rejection, of obliteration. What I'm talking about is intended to be the opposite. Now, again, I think we have a special claim, Anglo-Britain, as I call it. I think it's a special claim as a historical culture. Because if we go back, I said, I'm talking about the beginnings of English beginning much, much later than England, with Chaucer in the 14th century. If we go back to the beginning of an idea of England, that is Bede in the 8th century. And what's astonishing about Bede is, above all, where he is. And how many of you know? Bede is in Jarrow. He's in Northumberland. It is difficult to realize, but Jarrow is the intellectual center of Europe. We know, of course, the absurdity of a Hull as a city of culture, or whatever it is. But the idea that really Jarrow is the center of European culture. And one of the things I think we've forgotten is the astonishing precociousness of Anglo-Saxon culture. What we now know is that the Anglo-Saxon state was infinitely the most sophisticated in terms not only of its administration, in terms of its sense of unity post-Alfred, but also in terms economically. It has a unique machinery for the minting of the coinage. The coinage is reminted once every 3 or 4 years to preserve fineness. Can you imagine? It's just astonishing. If only we could do that. If only the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England was capable of actually maintaining the value of sterling, we wouldn't be in the crisis that we're in now. But so the Anglo-Saxon state has this extraordinary precociousness. And I think if you look at Bede, you begin to see why. Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people, remember, the English church exists before an English state, because at this point you are still in the world that Gordon Brown is trying to reimpose on us with the regionalization of England, the heptarchy of the 7 kingdoms. Bede does something quite extraordinary in his work. He reinvents, or possibly invents, the notion of serious chronology. Because, of course, the claims that I'm making for history as the center of a culture require a very different sort of history than the kind of history which is now taught in schools and universities. What he was trying to do, what Bede was trying to do, was actually to work out the proper sequence of events in time, when you had no fixed calendar and you had no single set of records. It's a completely extraordinary intellectual enterprise in which he brings together Roman chronology, Greek chronology, and Jewish chronology, and melds them all together and has this astonishing, innovative idea. We'll have a single central date, the date of the incarnation of our Lord, what we regard as the two eras, AD and BC. He invents that. He invents that as an anchor. And then his history of his ecclesiastical history of the English peoples, it's the first serious chronological account of one of the new peoples of Europe, the barbarian invaders, written from the perspective of the barbarian invader, not the invaded. It is intellectually an astonishing concept. And it seems to me that we need to recover that in how we teach history. I, of course, was that first generation, perhaps second generation, of those who did the PhD. And what we've got to understand is that was, in many ways, an extraordinary advance. We, like Bede, were concerned with the precision of chronology. We, like Bede, were trying to reconcile sources and to understand them. But unlike Bede, we had an astonishing narrowness, the knowing more and more about less and less. The thing that's transformed me as a historian, you referred to it. You were polite enough not to sneer at that notion of being a popular historian. I was used to saying, well, perhaps it's better to be a popular historian than an unpopular one. The whole idea of the big rhetoric of television uncovering enormous subjects. Simon Sharma did the history of Britain, which doesn't, of course, exist because England and Scotland have totally separate histories. I looked at the one institution along with the church which does have a continuous history, which is the history of the monarchy, from the beginning, from the Anglo-Saxons to now. And that changed me more than anything else. We need to go back to having both the detail, yes, but also the big picture, is exactly analogous to what makes a great politician. The great politician needs the big and the small, what only a handful, like Margaret Thatcher, like Churchill, were actually capable of doing. The big and the small, the absolute catastrophe when you get politicians who can do one or the other, or a politician like Starmer who can do neither. But it is this absolute imperative of a history which has that broad humanity, that, as I said, the ability to see the big picture in time. Now, alongside that, there's something else which it seems to me that we need to put very firmly under our microscope, or rather our telescope. We need both the microscope and the telescope of the world that I'm talking about. Remember, English is most peculiar, not only that it's very recent, it is a historic language in the sense that it's manifestly a creation of a known history. One of the greatest achievements of this university is the Oxford English Dictionary, which, if you actually look at it, is a dictionary composed on and compiled on historic principles. It's based on the fact of when a word first comes into the language. And this, we are the only language where you actually need to do this. If you look at the great, remember, there are two polar opposite cultures, England and France, with France being, if you're being polite about it, you say that they're never to be united halves of a perfect culture. If you're being impolite about it, as I have to live up to my reputation, don't I? I always say all bad ideas are French. But the channel itself, arguably being the widest strip of water in the world. Now, sorry, forgive me again. The French dictionary, the Dictionary of the Académie, which of course never finished. It's still begun in the reign of Louis XIV, and I think it's got up to M, is one that's composed on abstract principles of the deductions of words and what is allegedly the best French. The Oxford English Dictionary is completely different. It was done in record time, and it's based on usage, but also the fact that the language grows historically. I described that first process of Chaucer as melding two cultures together, the Anglo-Saxon and the French. Then, in the early 16th century, you get, under the impact of printing, of course, and solidified and generalized by printing, you get two other astonishing developments. You get the inclusion of the classical tradition. English, remember, up to the early 16th century, had very, very few abstract nouns. When Thomas More came to write his Richard III, he couldn't translate it into English. He wrote it in Latin, and then he begins a translation into English. And he realizes he can't finish it because he's writing in Latin, so he's able to do things like what we would regard as a perfectly normal sentence. He gives an illustration of the strangeness of Richard III, his ability to be a joker one minute and a terrifying creature another. And he gives a series of examples. And then he pulls them all together, indeed prefaces them by saying he's a man who could play many roles, which you can say in Latin. There was no word for role in English. He couldn't do it. He couldn't make it work. And what you see in the 16th century is this astonishing doubling, trebling of our vocabulary as you import Latin and Greek. And you finish up in the astonishing world of Shakespeare, in which, think of that great moment in Macbeth, in which Lady Macbeth, the murder, again, that amazing phrase of Duncan, who would have thought that the old man had so much blood in him? Now, has there ever been, look at how simple that is, how Anglo-Saxon. Has there ever been a more vivid conjuration of a horror? And then, of course, her hands soaked in blood. She tries to wash it off in her dreams. She dreams, washing, washing, washing. She walks, she sleepwalks. And as she does, she has this sense of the absolute indelibility, good Latin word of the thing. And she expresses them in these two lines that show the astonishing shift of the language. Can I wash the blood off? Can I wash it off in the sea? No, not even the sea. It would rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Two completely different languages, Latin and Anglo-Saxon, rammed together in this astonishing fashion. And of course, alongside that, there is the profound influence, not simply of Shakespeare, but the two great religious texts of the period, the translations. Again, the key importance of this accretive culture of translation and of translations of past texts, the profound importance of Tyndale's Bible, which feeds directly into the King James Bible, and of Cranmer's wonderful, largely a translation of the various religious texts of the books of hours, of the Mass, and so on, into the Book of Common Prayer. So again, a language which itself is historical, this constant drawing on tradition and weaving them in and entrenching, but it's a growth. It's not a confusion, it's a growth, which again is another reason, I'm afraid, why we have to have a very awkward spelling in English, because you need to recall the origins of words. If you don't, the language would just dissolve, because we're so bad at pronouncing words, and we slur over our vowels in such a terrible fashion. I think I would passionately campaign against a simplification of English spelling, because you need the conscious echoes. You need that funny Y and the PH to remind you that it's Greek. You need those echoes incorporated into the language. So there is then this sense of, this broad, my sense of memorialization through culture, my sense of transmission, my sense finally that, before I move on from this section of the lecture, how can we have a notion of education which doesn't involve at its absolute center the idea of cultural transmission? It is mad. The idea that you can be original without knowing what's gone before. How can you know it's original if you don't know what's gone before? All great painters, all great musicians, all great historians, all great politicians are profoundly aware of where they come from, as well as where they want to go to, and shape the means accordingly. So we've got then this idea of a cultural foundation as a means of cultural transmission. I want now to focus a little bit more clearly, to go down. We were talking about big and small. I want now to look at the idea of history and politics. It seems to me we've got to understand that we peculiarly are a country based in history. We do have a constitution. We have, or we did at least before 1997, one of the most profound and creative in the world, which is why so many countries have parliaments. Why until recently it's very difficult looking at ourselves as we do now, with a sense very often of shame and contempt, that sense of somewhere that was once central, that mattered, that is failing, the contempt which is expressed by a J.D. Vance. And remember, it's a contempt based on an earlier respect. It's a contempt based on the sense that England is where it all begins. We are the culture, remember, this is a complete paradox. We are the culture which has the oldest political system in the world as a continuous political culture. Japan, although it's got the older monarchy, has this violent rupture with the Meiji Restoration of the 19th century. We have, I think, and it is entirely demonstrable, a political culture that goes back directly to Magna Carta. There is simply no doubt about this. But at the same time, we are the country that created modernity. This again needs to be said. Anglo-Britain of the late 17th century invents the modern world. It invents the science of Newton, it invents the politics of Locke and others. It invents, again, the first globalization. The British Empire is globalization. The British Empire, the astonishing explosion of a country which, remember, in 1688 was a mere French dependency. Within 25 years, from 1688 to 1705, this country, which had merely been a French dependency, shatters the power of Louis XIV at Blenheim, which is a blow from which France never recovers. But it's done not by an equivalent state. There's something quite extraordinary. England, remember, is a quarter the size of France. It had a fraction of the population. The population of France is already 25 million. England was under 10. It's extraordinary. How did it do it? It did it. Go to the great hall of the Royal Naval Hospital at Greenwich. And what you will see there is a hymn to an idea of a modern state, a conscious both historically, it is profoundly historical. You have up there, you don't simply have Newton, you have up there the great Italian scientists, the great Polish scientists, and the great scientists of the ancient world. You have there entire notions of commerce, of arts, of sciences, all centering on an image of William III, the king who comes in 1689, crushing an extremely ugly and deeply bedraggled Louis XIV in the center. But it's an idea of a culture which is intensely historically rooted, itself developing modernity. And I'd be very happy to discuss that idea, which I know puzzles and shakes people. Because what we've got to understand is that tradition that goes back to Magna Carta is one that can continuously renew itself. This is the point that I'm wanting to get at, that this is not an idea of deadness. We've been so used to neophilia. We've been so used to the idea that there has to be rapid change. Surely, if we look back to the catastrophe which has overtaken England and Britain since 1997, we can see that constant modernity can be absolute, and a crying for the novel can be absolutely desperate. We need, I think, to recover a notion that the past, as I said with my quote from Chaucer, is a fertile soil and a necessary soil. So if we go back, what do we find Magna Carta does? It's often described, and I think described absurdly, as the beginnings of democracy. Of course it's not. Britain only becomes democratic rather late, at the beginning of the 20th century, with the granting of the vote to women in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. But what happens in the aftermath of Magna Carta, within about 100 years, is that you create a system of representative government. And a system of representative government which has a central idea. Everybody is bound by law because everybody has participated in making it. You are present in Parliament, either in person or by your representative. And that idea which, of course, conditions the fact that the king can't simply help himself to your money, he can't simply help himself to your lands, and he has to administer good justice to you. That idea is itself becomes the basis of the whole, what we conventionally call capitalism. We've got to understand, England has representative government, has a fundamental notion which is largely individualistic, which abolishes clans, which is why the importation of clan cultures from Pakistan have been so catastrophic, has these immensely sophisticated views of the inviolability of property, the need for the sound administration of justice, way, way, way back into the Middle Ages. In other words, that the foundations of modernity are old, are ancient. We do not have that moment of the Americans, of the French. We do not have that moment of a revolution, but then we don't need it, because our political system proved staggeringly flexible. No other European country could modernize without destroying its ancien regime. We did. When the Chartists march and demand the vote, they're not saying we want to pull down Parliament. They're saying we want a place in Parliament. When women demonstrate, the suffragettes, and do more than demonstrate, fling themselves onto horses, perform the most extraordinary acts. They're saying we want a part. They do not want to demolish, and they want to take part. And it's this astonishing flexibility. In other words, a tradition which completely paradoxic to us, creates modernity, and a tradition which is so flexible that it can accommodate modernity. And exactly the moment at which we fundamentally change this from 1997 is the moment at which our government ceases to be flexible. It's the paradox. It's a paradox which, of course, was completely understood by Disraeli. Disraeli comments, great conservative politician, that in a progressive country like Britain, change is inevitable and desirable. The question is not, should we change? It's how we should change. And he points out that things like the broadening of the franchise would change in accordance with the principles, because the idea of representation was already fundamental to English law, would change in accordance with the principles of Britain. The problem is, and dear me, how prophetic he was, he says the problem is when you change in accordance with abstract internationalism or abstract liberalism. And that's exactly the catastrophe that happened in 1997. The importation of alien notions like universal human rights, which have been, as we can now see, with the disaster of our immigration policy, the collapse of a notion of equality before the law, have been a kind of solvent of this great historical tradition. We need to recognize that. And then, finally, and two quick appendices now. I also want to argue that not simply is history, as I've tried to argue, the foundation of culture, the foundation of our politics. It's something else. It is the best way of actually understanding where we are now. I've just mentioned what I regard as the disaster of the years from 1997 to well, pretty much to now. What is the best way of understanding it? It's actually to do a comparison between the 2020s and the 1970s, to look at the extraordinary parallel, because there is a parallel. There is, of course, in the 1970s, there is the realization that the joint politics of Labour and Conservative, which had ruled England since the Second World War, the belief in Keynesianism, the belief in private prices and incomes policies, the attempt at controlling wages by legal means, the importance of nationalization and so on, had all led cumulatively to disaster. And you have a man, Keith Joseph, and a woman, Margaret Thatcher, the one acting as guru to the other, who make this break and come up with something different. Seems to me precisely what has gone wrong with our politics, which is why we're now seeing strange cross-dressing between Labour and Conservative. The wonderful line of Tim Stanley, who, by the way, regards himself as my successor. I'm a little jealous about this, but never mind. Tim's wonderful line, you vote Conservative and get tax rises, you vote Labour and get welfare cuts. This extraordinary moment of crossover. Why? Because from 1997 to 2000 and to now, effectively, we've had a coalition government. Blair and Gordon Brown between them utterly transformed the way we were governed. They took power away from this historic institution of Parliament, and they sent it off in two different directions, towards committees of experts, the quangos, and towards judges and lawyers in the other direction. There was no break in that at all in 2010. The Conservative Party did exactly the same and arguably made it worse. So, for example, Theresa May, not only, again, an expert committee, not only reinforces the powers of the Climate Change Committee, with the Climate Act of 2015, she actually legislates net zero by 2050, making it a legally binding target. She also does two other amazing things. She is responsible for the non-crime hate incidents, and she is responsible for the beginnings, fortunately stymied, of an attempt at making self-identification possible for transgenderism. A conservative politician. So in other words, what we saw up to the 1970s was exactly the same as we are now seeing now. Effectively, both political parties doing much the same thing. And there was a sort of solution, it wasn't complete, with Thatcher and Keith Joseph in the 1970s, realizing that you had to replace Keynesian economics with something much more robust and much more unpleasant. We are still at the moment of the quest as to what we have to do with the terrible disaster of 1997 to 2010. But I predict it will have to be exactly the same. The consensus will have to be broken. There will have to be an alternative. But the alternative I want is a going back. It's a restoration to that world that I was talking about, that world in which history and a constitutional tradition actually provided a means of adapting sympathetically, a means by which we could govern ourselves properly. And there's a final point I want to make, and this is a much more emotional one. We are in a quest for a cement. Some people now are turning to what is traditionally regarded as the foundation of our society, to a religious revival. I think that will be catastrophic, but I'm very much prepared to argue the point. History itself offers a kind of transcendence. To go into Westminster Cathedral, to go into St. Paul's, to go to Stonehenge, you're aware of all those that I've been talking about, those who've done these things, those who were at Magna Carta, those who shaped and reshaped the language. Go to Poets' Corner, you will see Chaucer, and you will see Shakespeare, and you will see all those in between and after them as well. And you don't even need to go to those great buildings. T.S. Eliot is the poet who best grasped this in the Four Quartets and in Little Gidding. And that's what I'd like to stop with. We're now in bright sunshine, in this extraordinary building which evokes the classical past. There's another past, of course, which is the past of the Middle Ages and the Anglo-Saxon period. You find that in our Parliament building. Why is the Palace of Westminster built in the Gothic? Because our freedoms don't come from a single act, don't come from a single revolution. They are, as I said, entrenched. And that Gothic, of course, you'll find in virtually every village, every little church, It was one of those churches at Little Gidding where Eliot had that vision of the sound of feet, dead people, dancing, fighting, loving, forgetting. So, while the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now and England.
Thank you for that. A bravura performance, I would call it. We have 10 minutes. I shall get into terrible trouble if I don't bring this session in on time. But I suspect that some of you in the audience would very much like to contribute. You may want to challenge. I'm wondering how many people here in the audience are Starky enthusiasts and how many are a sort of...
You're trying to start a fight, aren't you? Yes.
I am. That's what journalists do. Alternatively, you may have contributions, things you want to add. I'm just going to ask one quick question myself. You're trying to reverse history. History, I know this is a rather old-fashioned notion, but history is a linear thing. It goes in time. You're asking for a return, a reversal in many ways of things which over the last 100 years, the last 25 years, the last 30 years have developed. It can't happen. The world doesn't work.
It had happened before. Why did we have a restoration? We had an abominable revolution in the middle of the 17th century. We are the only people to have reversed a revolution without foreign intervention. And we restored. And we need to do that again. Otherwise, we're lost.
I knew you'd have an answer. There's a gentleman down here with red trousers who would like to come in. There's a microphone on its way to you, sir. Anybody else?
Right. John Strafford. David, 50 years ago, Sir Keith Joseph toured the country giving lectures to all and sundry with his solution to the problems of the time. Are you today's Sir Keith Joseph? And what is your solution?
Well, I'm afraid I am touring the country. That's exactly what I'm doing. I've called it my evangelical moment. Me, a hardened atheist, admittedly a high church atheist. I am literally doing that, along with Mark Littlewood of PopCon. We are completely promiscuous. We will talk to anybody. I have taught not only to conservative associations, to Reform, to the New Culture Forum, to you, and I'm trying basically to give the same message, which is the notion that it is taking up your challenge. Not only is it possible, it's necessary. We've tried neophilia. We've tried adopting international liberal institutions, and it's failed. Because, of course, international liberalism doesn't actually believe in government by the people. It believes in government by expert and lawyers. We now have two completely clashing notions of democracy. The German, French, EU, Starmerite, Blairite view that democracy means the protection of minorities through legal entrenchment, freedom and diversity. There's a wonderful editorial in the Stern magazine which has this marvelous notion that German youth should fight for freedom and diversity. Do you see young lads nailing their colours to the mast of diversity? No. But what we're doing is, the remedy is exactly what Keith Joseph talked about. The Conservative Party has got to recognise what it did so terribly wrong. It was wrong in the 1960s and 70s to go along with Keynesianism and nationalisation and bureaucratisation. It's been wrong to go along with the development of the quangocracy and this mad notion of the rule of law. Have you all noticed this bizarre notion that judges now think they're above Parliament? We've actually seen this amazing case of the Sentencing Council, in which Lord Justice William Davis basically told the Lord Chancellor to piss off, in the most elegant judicial language. Now, that is a complete defiance of the English tradition. The English tradition is that law is made by you. This is what the idea of Parliament is, what I was talking about, this notion of universal representation. In other words, in the Middle Ages, the idea of representation was a semi-fiction. And it became a parody with the corruption of the 18th century. And then through the 19th and 20th century, it becomes real. But what we're surely realizing is, unless law commands the respect of the public, it is not good law. You can look at the other way of dealing with things. If you look, for example, in America, America comes very near to reversing that tradition with the creation of a Supreme Court as the final referee of the Constitution. Look at how America handled, for example, the deeply contentious issue of abortion. It did it by means of judicial ruling. Roe versus Wade, which completely absurdly read into the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights, a doctrine of abortion, which, as we all know, just is a madness. It was regarded as an infinite wickedness in the 18th century. We did the opposite. We legalized abortion by proper parliamentary debate and argument over years and years and I'm gay. We did exactly the same with gay rights. We didn't invoke abstract notions of gay rights. Instead, we argue, and dear me, ladies and gentlemen, some thoughts of Starky you have not envisaged. Starky leading a demonstration, for early gay rights. I was one of those, and we of course made it all rather camp and wonderful as we took the Conservative campaign for homosexual equality, and we reinvented it as Torch. Tory campaign, homosexual equality, and we took a wonderful, do you remember in those days, rather than a withered tree, the symbol of conservatism was the flaming torch, but we gave it a wonderful quiff at the back. But what we've got to do, being serious, we have got to do that Keith Joseph exercise. We've got to say that it is an utter perversion of this astonishing historic constitution. The supremacy of Parliament isn't a fiction. It's not a supremacy, as people like John Bercow and whatever tried to make it, of a single body, the House of Commons. It's you. It's Parliament as your representative. And it's that we've got to recover. Otherwise, because what we've seen at the moment is this strange, I was again talking about.
I'm going to, I can see the unstoppable flow is...
Yes, it's a good idea. Stop. Just a second. It's why we've now got these two separate words. Democracy, which means protecting minorities, and we've had to invent populism, and which means what democracy used to mean.
Okay, anybody else?
Yes,
lady here in the striped shirt, please, and then a gentleman behind her. Yes.
Hello, my name's Amelie Smith. I'm a lawyer, I'm afraid, but I do agree with you about parliamentary supremacy. I wonder, are you intending to speak at Westminster Hall or to the collected judiciary in England and Wales and Scotland? Could that be arranged?
Would they have you?
Well, I'm going to be invited to speak to at the Inns of Court on these ideas. We are also, of course, because of the wonderful way in which the internet works, all sorts of bright young people are coming up with these ideas. And what I'm trying to do, and Keith Joseph didn't just go round, he actually created bodies. He creates a Centre for Policy Studies and so on, and we're looking to do that kind of exercise. I can't actually name them because it's a little bit secret at the moment, but we're in other words, there's a question of getting broad popular acceptance. That's absolutely crucial, and above all, broad popular understanding. Remember, the terrible politics that we've had for so many years are a politics which treats you with contempt, which simply assumes you can't understand. and that you will vote with 2p on income tax this way and 2p on income tax the other. I believe that that's not true. But what you've got to have alongside it is exactly what Keith Joseph did, the broad popular movement and the expert advice. And above all, the careful preparation for government, which is exactly what we saw with Stephen Miller, with Trump Mark II, with Trump's second term, and that extraordinary pile of executive orders that were all ready to go. We're working on that too.
I'm going to ask one more contribution from the floor, gentleman with the microphone, and then I have one question for you myself.
Fine.
Yes, we can hear you.
It's a lovely talk, thoroughly fascinating, but I didn't quite understand the catastrophe that follows from 1997. Would you explain that again?
Yes, it is when Mr. Blair comes to power. This is the day that is rather like the triumph of Adolf Hitler, if it had happened. No, I'm being really, really serious. It seems to me it is a moment of genuine catastrophe. Remember, what you do is you set up, for example, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, the Climate Change Committee, English Nature, which is why, very simply, we have had the rampant inflation that we've done. I mean, the record of the Bank of England is utterly shocking. I mean, grotesque. The record of the committee that's responsible for the selling the public debt. Can you imagine? We actually sold index-linked debt when interest rates were virtually zero. I mean, you were guaranteed to lose. It's because of English nature that you rule that you have 120 million baht tunnel when you're trying to construct HS2. I mean, and again, it's this whole judicial business that means judges now control. What do they control? Whether you can drill in the North Sea, whether you can frack, or wages. The Equality Act actually legislates the Marxist labour theory of value, which is why Birmingham has been bankrupted.
Very quickly, last question. You mentioned America. How do you read what is happening now in America, where it seems that they are running an experiment in real time, in going back as you would like to see it, but it's being conducted by principally an unelected
techie, a grand techie.
Do we call him, indeed, with apparent disregard for the American Constitution? The courts are stepping in.
Right, quickly to stop you. There are two completely different views of the American Constitution at this point. The executive agencies which are being dissolved were created by the man who in many ways Trump most resembles, though the absolute opposite pole politically, which is Roosevelt of the 1930s. And they were done by a very peculiar decision of the Supreme Court, which takes the ability of the federal government to deal with interstate trade and effectively uses it to come up with the idea that you could have this massive executive agencies. So, in other words, and what is opposed to them is a view of the rule of law, which is a meta view of the rule of law. So the rule of law sits above politics.
But however these agencies were created, they are funded by remit of Congress, by a representative assembly, and what is happening now flies in the face of what Congress wanted.
Well, the Congress may have funded them. Congress did not specify what they should do. I mean, you can.
But the money is being. We could
yes,
debate this for too
long.
long.
All I'm doing, just very quickly, so that everybody understands this. There are these two radically different views of the relationship of law and politics. The question is, which do you believe should control the other? We, with the creation of the Supreme Court, with the extraordinary transformation of the idea of the rule of law associated with the work of Lord Bingham from 2006, have come very near to the view that Parliament should be subordinated to judges. Hence the astonishing ruling of the Supreme Court, led by Baroness Hale, she of the spider brooch, that Boris Johnson had broken the law by proroguing Parliament. This is deranged. This this defies the Bill of Rights. And what we've got to do, we've to decide, do you prefer to be ruled by experts and judges, or do you prefer to rule yourselves?
And on that note...
That is the key point.
On that note, we really do have to leave it. David Starkey, thank you very much indeed. Your audience clearly liked you. A reminder that he will be signing copies of his books across the road in the Norrington Room in Blackwell's immediately after this. And if you really want to take issue with or engage with him, I'm sure you will be happy to engage. Though I warn you, he can't stay all day. He's got to be in Hereford later. David Starkey, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to you.